Today we're going to be comparing the two best cameras for prosumer video. The Sony FX30 is a camera that is ahead of its time a little. I think that in the future, we're going to need cameras that are more video-centric in this prosumer market than still-centric. Going back to kind of the camera that invented the prosumer market, the Canon 6D and the Nikon D700 series, we have this stills camera that has a full frame, generally speaking, full frame sensor, and offers really great image quality, just kind of dumbed down in certain ways. Usually an area that was really dumbed down was the video specs. Well, with this camera here, that's been flipped on its head. This is a camera that's really all about video and has some phoned in stills specifications. While I do think that this camera is a great example of what I think the future is of cameras, I believe they're going to move more and more in this direction. I actually think that there is another camera that actually does what this camera is trying to do, but a little better, at least for 2023. And that camera is the Panasonic S5IIX. This camera offers, I believe, even better video specifications, better handling, and a better hybrid experience. And today I'm going to tell you why I think that is. Before I get started with explaining why I think the S5IIX actually is a better option for most of us, and why you might still want to pick the FX30, I want to talk a little bit about why these two cameras are so relevant to compare. So, both of these cameras have one key feature in common, and that is active cooling. Both the FX30, as you can see here with its vent on the side here, and the S5IIX, which actually has the vent underneath the viewfinder compartment right here, as well as on the sides of the viewfinder. These two cameras basically check one box that has to be checked no matter what for me to consider it a professional video camera. And that is no record limitations beyond battery life and memory card space. One of the #1 frustrations for me with my third camera, the one actually filming this right now, the Sony a7 IV, is going to be that it has significant overheating issues in 4K. So in my mind, the Sony a7 IV really is exclusively a 1080p camera in those very high pressure situations. Because in my mind, I need to bet the budget of the gig I'm on that my camera will not stop rolling in the middle of an interview, in the middle of an event or ceremony, or in the middle of really anything. My camera cannot go down. This is the hallmark of a professional video camera. Beyond resolution, beyond fast frame rates, beyond any other spec you can think of, if you can't just hit record and predict that that camera will keep rolling for an hour, 2 hours, and be able to bet money on the fact that it will do that, it is not a professional camera. That is why the a7 IV, even though I use it for video all the time, in my mind really doesn't compete with these two for video as a general rule. Now, with that said, you can build a business with either of these cameras. You can shoot weddings with either of these cameras. You can shoot interviews. You can build a company with this. But why is it that I feel that the S5IIX is better? We're gonna start with handling. Now, this has actually been something that I have been trying to work through in my mind. I have really tried to like the FX30. I like the way it looks. I think it's probably one of the coolest looking cameras Sony's ever made. I love the tally likes. I love the idea of the built-in 3.5mm screws all over the camera. But for me and for many of you out there, this is the way you're going to use the camera most of the time, either in this format or with an external cage built onto it. And because of that, I think that we run into the simple issue that it's not designed well ergonomically to be used as a run and gun camera in the hand. The camera demands that you hold your thumb on the camera on the top like this, so you can manipulate the joystick. Once again, in theory, you can use the touchscreen for everything you'd use the joystick for, but keep in mind that my other hand is likely on the lens, zooming and focusing on the lens itself. So the fact that I might need to be able to use this joystick is huge. Here's my problem. This action of pulling my thumb from the front of the camera to the back of the camera is just impossible to do smoothly. And this issue is even exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the buttons I want to manipulate are actually further down on the camera. I literally have to basically completely separate my hand from the camera to manipulate the buttons on the back of it. And this is something that I think is just a dumb design concept. Now, you might say to yourself, well, you're gonna be using the top handle all of the time, so you don't really care. To be honest with you, I don't think the top handle would really solve this issue because you're still gonna have to use two hands to operate the camera. And what this means is very often I find myself wanting a third hand to be able to manipulate my camera and my lens and whatever else is going on around me. This issue is also added to by the fact that both two super important parts of the camera are hidden all the way on this side. Both the on-off switch is over here, one of my least favorite on-off switches I've ever used. It is mushy. I can't tell you how many times I've thought I've pushed it when I haven't actually gotten it shifted over. I despise this, actually. It's one of my least favorite parts about the camera. And then my mode button is over here as well. Once again, just to be able to change my camera's mode, I have to use two hands to do it because I have to hit the mode button with one hand and I have to manipulate the dial with the other to move through that. Why this camera does not just have a standard PASM dial like every other camera, I honestly don't really know. On the contrary, the S5IIX is designed impeccably. I love this thing. It has a good solid grip. It has access to 5 custom buttons with the front hand, right? So you've got your shutter button, dial, you've got these 3 buttons, this 4th button, and this 5th button in the grip. And I also have, just because of where the joystick is, I don't have to move my whole hand and camera to be able to access what's going on the back of the camera. This is huge because this just loses, if I'm trying to hold the camera like this and I'm shifting my hand back, it's going to shake the camera mid-shot. Whereas if my hand is already in position with my thumb on the joystick, I can access this super cool AF and AF/MF mode dial. This has AFC, AFA, and manual focus on it, which is super cool. You also have this mode selection button here, which is super awesome because you're able to pick between different zone focusing options, which is the click of a button. Then you have, of course, your AF on button, your other dial. Both of these dials are easier to get with gloves than the dials on the Sony, which maybe isn't a big deal for a lot of people, but it's a big deal to me. And then because your finger is already on the back of the camera like this, I have even easier access to subtly grab both the D-pad and this back dial, as well as this function menu button. Of course, these bottom two, you're always gonna have to let go of the camera largely to be able to hit those. It's a stretch, but simply put, you can operate more with this camera than you can with this camera in the field. And for that, I think that the S5IIX just absolutely is the better camera in the hand. Next up, we need to talk about image quality. Now, the important difference between these two cameras is the sensor size. The S5IIX has a full frame sensor. You can see it here. Look at that big chunk of sensor there. Whereas your FX30 is going to have an APS-C size sensor. Now, to be honest with you, I don't think that this is a deal breaker. You shouldn't despise the FX30 just because it has an APS-C size sensor. But you do get inherent advantages from the larger sensor. Those inherent advantages are better low light, better dynamic range in low light, because each of those pixels are just straight up bigger than the pixels on the FX30. To be honest with you, the actual image coming off of this camera and this camera in good light is fairly similar, especially if you just shoot in 4K. They both shoot 4K, 422, 10-bit internally, both in an all-eye compression and a long GOP compression. But this camera brings you all the way up to 6.2K internal open gate and 5.9K and 16:9, whereas this camera maxes out at 4K. Now, this camera does have 4K up to 120 frames per second. However, that is an additional 1.5x crop on top of the crop already on the camera, meaning you're shooting with a 2x crop total. And by the time you get to that small of a sensor, the dynamic range, the noise performance of the 4K 120, in my mind, renders that feature essentially useless. It is noisy, it does not have the dynamic range, and after I put in all the work to denoise and resharpen the image to get a nice detailed image out of this, I may as well have just shot 1080, 120 frames per second on my A7 IV or on my S5IIX. You've been seeing a lot of examples as I've been talking about this of these two cameras, footage from the field. In the end, I give a hands down win to the S5IIX. Keep in mind though, if you are an FX30 user, or if you do pick the FX30, you can still get a brilliant image out of it. It's just when they're both in front of you, it's impossible to not see that the S5IIX is the more stellar option. So next up, I want to talk about ecosystem, and this is where the FX30 finds a leg to stand on. The FX30 is part of the incredible Sony Alpha line of cameras, a line of cameras that enables you to upgrade to the FX3 for a full frame, brilliant sensor. I haven't used the FX3 a ton, but I've used the Sony a7S III a lot. That is a beautiful sensor and still king in low light performance. So even though this camera's not great, the Sony system has a great upgrade for that feature. You also have cameras like the A1, the Sony FX6, FX9. Within this lineup, you have also professional telephoto glass like the 400 f2.8 and the 600 f4. The Sony E-mount is such a robust ecosystem, beautifully put together by Sony. And notably, the FX30 is going to be towards the bottom of that. And if you're looking at the way Sony would present things, it's probably the lowest end professional Sony camera that they sell. Whereas on the other hand, with the Panasonic S5IIX, I think there is a very real argument that this is the best camera that Panasonic currently makes within the L-mount alliance, and very likely one of the best cameras in the entire L-mount alliance put together. Now, if you don't know, Panasonic is part of a partnership with both Sigma and Leica, and now a few more brands, to produce a all-in-one mount system. Kind of similar to how Panasonic was with Micro Four Thirds, right? It's a ecosystem all using the same mount, which is super cool because that means I can natively put Leica L-mount glass on my S5IIX, meaning lenses like the 24-90 f2.8 to f4 are within this ecosystem here. Here's the problem. When we're talking about prosumer level cameras and then you start throwing out $5,000, $6,000 lenses, I think that that's generally speaking kind of silly. So in reality, you have Sigma's lenses and Panasonic's S-mount lenses for this camera. And guess what? You have a much larger Sony Alpha line compared to Panasonic's S line of lenses. And You also have all of Sigma's lenses as well, plus Tamron's lenses, plus so many lenses. I mean, there's so much good glass for this camera. It's insane. Now, once again, a lot of that is full frame when it comes to high-end glass, but you also have Sony's APS-C glass as well. Maybe not the most impressive, but ultra small, lightweight, and sharp lenses as well. In other words, the Sony ecosystem is so much more put together than the Panasonic ecosystem. It's unarguable. That being said, the Panasonic ecosystem has a chance to grow a ton over the next couple years. All they need is those high-end camera bodies like the S1 Mark II, the S1H Mark II, and the S1R Mark II. Currently, I'm kind of holding my breath for that because if we're able to get some really impressive specs like 8K in the lineup for the first time, keep in mind, there's no 8K in this lineup, there's 8K in this system. However, when you think about what they could do with the S1H Mark II, with the S1 Mark II, with the S1R Mark II, with Leica's cameras, if Sigma decides to make a follow-up to the Sigma, I'm trying to think what the name of that little Sigma camera is. Anyway, if Sigma adds lenses and cameras, you could have such an awesome system here. Right now, everything's in place for the L-mount Alliance to be a super compelling system. All they're missing is those high-end camera bodies. And why do I mention that being the only thing that's missing? Isn't Lumix really bad with autofocus? Well, that's a huge thing that's changed with the Panasonic S5IIX and the S5 II. They finally put phase detect autofocus into the L-mount Alliance. And let me tell you, this is an impressive implementation, especially for the first time. Is it better than Sony? Honestly, it's not. But for basic usage, I think it is really compelling as an option. I've used it a lot in professional settings already, and it's not done anything that I wouldn't expect my Sony to do. One of the big misconceptions I think about Sony and Canon's autofocus is it's rock solid and it never has issues. It really does. It still second guesses, finds faces where it's not supposed to be, and just has an issue. You need to be manipulating where it's focusing, you need to be manipulating the speed and sensitivity, and the mode it's in. In other words, you kind of need to treat autofocus like it's in a manual way in order to get the best out of either of these cameras. But for a skilled operator, you're going to get better results out of the FX30. I firmly believe that. The S5IIX is just a little harder to use. The subject tracking outside of face and eye detect is just not as good as what you have out of Sony. And for me in particular, that's a pretty big deal. So even though Panasonic has shown an impressive first iteration of autofocus, Sony still wins in this category. In conclusion, which of these cameras is actually better? Well, toe-to-toe, it's no competition. The S5IIX and the S5 II are better cameras than the FX30, both for stills and for video. I think that's somewhat of a bold statement, but I can tell you from using the cameras side by side, I have no desire to pick up the FX30 over the S5IIX. Besides the fact that I own way more awesome lenses for the FX30 than I do for the S5IIX. So that is what I have for you today. My recommendation is the S5IIX if you're looking for the best camera right now. If you're looking for a system to grow into, I think the Sony FX30 is a slightly better option. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it valuable, please hit that like button, hit subscribe, and I'll see you on the next adventure.